Hello everyone and welcome to this afternoon's event, the last in the current season of research seminars hosted by the British Centre for Literary Translation at the University of East Anglia in Norwich, England. My name is Duncan Large. I'm the BCLT's academic director and coordinator of the research seminar. As with previous events, this seminar is being recorded, and the recording will be available soon on BCLT's YouTube channel, where you'll also find recordings of previous seminars and other BCLT events. I'm delighted to introduce this afternoon's speaker. Dr. Sophie Stevens joined us in the School of Literature, Drama and Creative Writing at the University of East Anglia as a Leverhulme Early Career Fellow in November of last year. Now that she's had a chance to get her metaphorical feet under the virtual desk a little, I thought this would be a good opportunity for Sophie to introduce herself and her current research. Her Leverhulme project is titled Latin American Women Dramatists as Artists, Activists, and Agents of Change. And it investigates the work of Latin American women dramatists in order to explore links between activism, performance, digital networking, and translation. Between 2017 and 2020, Sophie worked on the Translation Acts research strand of Language Acts and World Making, a flagship project funded by the Arts and Humanities Research Council in the UK as part of the Open World Research Initiative. Sophie's work has been published in Symposium and the Mercurian. Sophie is the author of Uruguayan Theatre in Translation, Theory and Practice, which will be published by Legenda later this year, and which includes 3 new stage-ready translations of plays by Raquel Diana, Estela Golovchenko, and Carlos Maggi. She's a member of the Out of the Wings Theatre Collective and has presented English translations at the Out of the Wings Festival, New Spanish Playwriting Festival, and the Latin American Theatre Festival at the Southwark Playhouse. I might add that earlier in this year's series, we heard our then translator in residence, William Gregory, present on translating the plays of Bosco Cayo, and theatre translation has become an increasingly important genre for us at BCLT. Now, before I hand over to Sophie, let me just say that after Sophie's talk, we'll have plenty of time for a question session. We're using the Zoom webinar platform, and that allows you to submit questions via the Q&A button, as well as to upvote others' questions that you'd particularly like to see answered. That function will be available all the way through, so do feel free to submit your questions and I'll put them to Sophie on your behalf at the end. For now, though, it's my great pleasure to hand over to Sophie for a talk which is titled Inhabiting the Play, Theatre Translation as a Productive Site of Reflection and Research. Sophie.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Duncan. I hope you can hear me okay. Great. Then let's get started. Thank you so much for the very kind introduction. And thank you to everyone from near and far for joining. It's a great delight and a real privilege to be invited to present as part of the BCLT Research Seminar Series and as part of such an exciting programme. As Duncan mentioned, I joined UEA, in my mind quite recently, in November last year, and my research is supported by the Leverhulme Trust. But I've also received support in many different ways from my new colleagues in BCLT and across the School of Literature, Drama and Creative Writing. It has also been wonderful to work with students on the MA Literary Translation programme, and I think some of them are here today, and also on the new module Writing Across Borders for undergraduate students, and I've been made to feel really welcome at UEA. For me, the past few months have been a process of transitioning from working on the Language Acts and World Making project, where the foundations for my current research were set, to beginning my Leverhulme project at UEA. During this time, I've been reflecting on what I carry across from my previous work, and also developing and refining my research questions. Throughout much of this time, I've been translating, specifically working on my English translation of the play L'Anemone et Le Boar, The Anemone and The Boar, by Argentine dramatist Mónica Maffia. And it's for these reasons that the ideas of reflection and research are incorporated into the title of my talk today. This talk encapsulates much of my recent work and introduces my current research project, which Duncan already gave the title of, Latin American Women Dramatists as Artists, Activists and Agents of Change. It also reflects the fact that I'm at a stage during which my research project is evolving and taking shape. And so I'll be posing lots of questions, many more than I can actually answer. But my objective is to show how the process of translation has enabled me to articulate those questions, which relate both to translation practice itself, and so to the work of the theatre translator, and also to translation research. When I refer to the process of theatre translation, I'm referring to the work involved in rendering a dramatic text into a new language, which involves being in dialogue with the text, and sometimes with the author. It involves experimenting with and articulating the words that make up the dramatic text. And I argue, it involves temporarily inhabiting the dramatic text. I'll provide examples from my own translation practice to illustrate the ways in which I undertake these processes of dialogue, experimentation, and inhabiting, and why they are so fundamental to my process. This talk will provide insights into how I view translation as research and how that functions in the context of a broader research project. I'm really keen to discuss these ideas with those of you attending the talk today. I should probably say now that I will not be sharing a PowerPoint presentation on screen. For me, it didn't seem the right thing to do for this talk, and it can sometimes feel like another barrier in the online world. So I invite you to listen, and perhaps this invitation comes as a relief for those of you who are in need of a screen break. But for anyone who wants to ask questions about any references or quotations, you can do that in the Q&A or by contacting me at my UEA email address, which is available on the website. My talk is split into 3 parts. The first is this introductory section in which I want to set up some of the key themes and explore the idea of inhabiting the dramatic text. The second part of this talk will focus on the idea of reflection. It will explore how translation sparks questions and how it asks us to reflect on the ways in which our own experience connects to the world that we encounter on stage through the translated text. I will reflect specifically on how theatre text written for audiences in another country and at another time, then translated into English for a contemporary audience, can play an important role in helping us to make sense of the challenges that we currently face. I argue that this process of reflection involves both the translators who undertake the task of translating the text from one language to another, and also the audience members who experience that text through a reading or through a performance. And I relate this to some specific examples of theatre translation work and initiatives developed in the last year during the period of the pandemic. I'll argue that theatre translation is necessary, that it always has a role to play and it always has important work to do in the world. And this idea of the work that theatre translation does in the world draws on Doris Sommer's idea of the work of art in the world from her 2014 book with that title, as well as some of the concepts and ideas developed through the Language Acts and World-Making project that I was part of. The third part of the talk will focus on the idea of research. I'll introduce my Leverhulme project and talk specifically about how the experience of translating the Anemone and The Boar has enabled me to refine my research questions. This play is Mónica Maffia's most recent work and is currently in rehearsals in the original Spanish for performances in Buenos Aires in Argentina and Montevideo in Uruguay later this year. The play is set in Spain in 1936. This is the period at the end of the Second Spanish Republic, which was 1931 to 1936. And so it immediately precedes the Spanish Civil War and the Franco dictatorship. It tells the story of 3 women with differing political views, affiliations, and motivations who are brought together through their work to present a weekly radio programme. And I'll return to that play later on. As I said earlier in this introduction, my talk focuses on the experience of setting up a new project, which incorporates translation practice and translation research. I realised that many of the terms I've already used to describe my experience of beginning my Leverhulme research, and which will echo throughout this talk, are actually ideas and metaphors that are often used in reference to translation itself: movement, transition, change, and carrying across. It is therefore perhaps fitting that these ideas resonate throughout the talk, because these concepts can be useful when conceptualizing the actions that we undertake as translators. I think in particular, the ideas of movement, change, and carrying across are useful in ascribing a physicality to the translation process, because translation always asks that we move and look beyond our own experiences and surroundings. This is where I want to introduce the idea of inhabiting the dramatic text and moving into it. This can happen in lots of different ways, sometimes in seemingly very small ways, as we work as translators to inhabit the world of the text that we are translating. The idea of the translation process as involving physical movement is key to understanding some of the work that we do. This might involve visiting a place where the original text is set, or one like it. I know that I and other translator colleagues have visited places ranging from convents to shopping centres to beaches. It might involve visiting a research centre, library, or archive to investigate the historical context of the text, or another piece of work that the dramatic text is in dialogue with. My own work as a theatre translator has undoubtedly been enriched by opportunities to carry out research in universities, theatres, and libraries, where I've been really aided by the support and insights from many generous and knowledgeable scholars, subject specialists, and playwrights. Many translators describe movement as part of their process of working through the translation, and I've heard many colleagues discuss walking, exercising, and generally being outdoors as a way to think through the challenges in translation. Often translators have a special interest in a place where they have lived or worked, and so they have moved and inhabited that country or region. And that is certainly the case for me with Uruguay and Argentina, as I've previously lived in both of those places. In theatre translation, these ideas of movement and physicality are further amplified when the translation becomes the basis for the work of staging the play, which is undertaken by actors and creative teams. And as theatre translators, we might also move again into the space of the rehearsal room to contribute to and to support the work of those actors as the text itself moves through their bodies as they begin experimenting with how to perform it. I also thought that perhaps in this time when we're working at a distance from one another, it's also important to remember that translators often meet authors, publishers, and collaborators at events, readings, performances, book fairs, and conferences. And so translation often arises from these interactions and relationships in a shared physical space. My own theatre translation work and research has been enhanced by the experience of going to the theatre in Uruguay and Argentina. My creative process as a theatre translator has been enriched by knowledge of, awareness of, and contact with the spaces in which theatre takes place, and the different encounters, exchanges, and conversations that have taken place in theatre queues, lobbies, and auditoriums. These are perhaps the less tangible aspects of the research carried out as part of the process of translating a dramatic text. And I of course acknowledge that not every translator moves through all of these types of spaces and interactions in their translation process. Every translation and every translator will be different. And of course, sadly, I cannot inhabit a theatre space in Uruguay, Argentina, or sadly, given the current coronavirus pandemic, even in London, as often as I would like to. But these experiences are and always will be an incredibly important part of my process. For me, they are all actions involving movement, which I undertake in order to inhabit the world of the dramatic text as I study, research, and ask questions of the text in order to begin the process of crafting the translation for the target language and culture. Sirkku Aaltonen, I'll repeat her name again, sorry. Sirkku Aaltonen presents the idea of the translator as a tenant, and that helps to encapsulate all these small acts of movement that we undertake. Aaltonen develops these ideas of movement in a way that I find particularly productive and creative, precisely because she places emphasis on the way in which the translator temporarily moves into the text, rather than on the idea of the movement of the text itself. This is a short quotation from Aaltonen. Translators, and through them entire theatrical systems and subsystems, move into texts which have been found suitable for a particular purpose. These texts have had other tenants who have left in them sediments of their histories, and there will be new tenants who continue to do so. Whenever a play is translated, it necessarily undergoes a process of interpretation and transformation as it moves into the target language. By referring to the idea of the translator as a tenant, I propose that the translator adopts an approach whereby they think about inserting themselves into an existing literary and dramatic tradition. In this way, they become part of that tradition, but they also shape it for a new audience and think creatively about how it can be retold for them. By thinking about how, as translators, we retell the story for a new audience by becoming part of the text, we place emphasis on the translation as an extension of the original, in the way, to quote Walter Benjamin, in its ever-renewed, latest, and most abundant afterlife. The focus of the translator is to construct the text for and in the target culture, so that the actors, directors, and dramaturges can then begin to occupy it to develop it for performance. Aaltonen's comments are also important because they remind us that the translation process is the first step of the process in creating the mise-en-scène, and the translator is part of the creative team who will enable the staging of the dramatic text. It is here that I really want to introduce the idea of the translated dramatic text as a site for reflection, both for those involved in creating it, the translator, actors, director, and other members of the theatre company, and for the audiences. Translators and theatre artists will inhabit the text and understand it based on their current ideas, prejudices, concerns, and views. We almost always view, interpret, understand, and engage with it from the place in which we find ourselves at that time. Our current situation has an impact on how we read and receive narratives from other places. For the translator, their interpretation might be changed and informed through research, which enables the translator to understand the original work in its context, and this can transform the way it's then presented to target audiences. This is why the idea of dialogue and the constant questioning of the text, bombarding it with questions, to quote Patrice Pavis, is so important. We have to be open to the text and what it might be speaking about, especially in ways that challenge our expectations, both about the source context and language and about the target situation. We have to be aware that a play is an imagined world, and in that world, many ideas and concepts can coexist, and this can challenge the ways in which we think and make sense of the world. The tendency to view and interpret translated theatre from where we are now is not in itself a bad thing. By interpreting theatre from our current place, we can make connections with theatre experienced by others at other moments and enable the voices and ideas to speak afresh and anew into our current situation. As translators work to reactivate those voices, we engage with concepts, actions, and ways of responding to crises that have originated in other places and at other times, but which are relevant to us today. The translator identifies ways in which the translator play can intervene in conversations, discourses, and dialogues surrounding issues affecting the target society. This process of creating connections between the source and target context is, in my understanding and in my own translation process, a fundamental aspect of the work of theatre translators. Translated theatre brings new ideas and perspectives into dialogue with current issues and discourses. It allows voices which spoke about a situation which has gone before to resonate in the target context. In this way, connections between source and target context are created, and audiences may be surprised, shocked, and stimulated to find that voices from contexts which may initially have seemed different and distant can speak meaningfully and forcefully into their current situation. As the text moves into the target context, the idea of the remainder, the sediment specified by Aaltonen, the traces left behind by previous occupants, is useful in thinking about the ways in which aspects of the source culture and context continue to exist in the new dramatic text. The translation can serve both to expose an aspect of the source culture, but also to provoke discussions about a similar topic or related one in the target culture. Those new insights provided by translated theatre are significant. In my view, theatre in translation always demands that we examine ourselves, our reactions, our responses, and our responsibilities. And it is for that reason that it creates a space for reflection. Theatre in translation can open up new ways of thinking about ourselves. As audiences, translation challenges us to think in new ways. It is for this reason that I argue that theatre in translation creates a laboratory. To echo Antoine Vitesse's idea, it is a space in which to encounter new concepts, challenge the status quo, and experiment with ways of finding solutions to challenges and crises that we face. It is a space in which to test, to trial, to refine, and to encounter. Sarah Maitland reminds us that by reaching outwards to revisit what we think we know and understand about the world around us, we are also required to revisit what we think we know and understand about ourselves. Therefore, theatre in translation is not just about seeing something other than ourselves. It always challenges us to reflect on who we are and how we are acting in our current circumstances. Despite the difficulties currently faced by the arts sector, which are immense, I have been inspired by the ways in which artists and theatre companies working with translated texts have responded by creating work which brings people together at a time when we feel very separated, even isolated. A lot of new ways of working have emerged during the pandemic, with theatre companies and groups transforming their practices to create ways of connecting and working online. The Out of the Wings Theatre Collective, which I'm part of, moved their monthly table reads online via Zoom, and recordings of a series of monologues by Abilio Esteves, translated by Kate Eaton, were produced as a meditation on solitude under the title Ceremonias Pandémicas. Some of these recordings, as well as a host of other events involving online readings, discussion panels, and showcases, were part of an online Winter Warmer event in February, the first of its kind for Out of the Wings. Foreign Affairs have conducted their theatre translator training programme and showcase online. And theatre company Cut the Cord used Arts Council England funding to create an international play reading group, which came together every week for a workshop or panel about a translated play over the course of last summer. This involved partnerships with theatre publishers, playwrights, directors, translators, and facilitators. I was invited to lead a workshop on Uruguayan theatre and culture when the participants read The Rage of Narcissus by Sergio Blanco, translated and directed by Daniel Goldman. In the workshop, we discussed Uruguayan theatre traditions, the idea of national theatre, artistic exchange between Uruguay and Europe, and ways of storytelling. The reason I wanted to mention these different initiatives and programmes developed during the period of the pandemic is that very few of the plays featured were written specifically for or about this moment of the pandemic. Although it should be noted that there are exciting initiatives to commission and translate new plays at this time, such as the Poor Connection Project, which is a collaboration between Argentine playwrights, translators, and also Language Acts and World-Making Project based in the UK, and the Institute for Modern Languages Research in London. It is not only plays about the current health crisis and pandemic that will help us to understand it and to respond to it in creative, thoughtful, and productive ways. Plays about isolation, failures in communication, illness, families, and ingrained inequalities can all provide insights into what we are experiencing now. Theatre and theatre translation have a role to play in helping us to examine and explore the challenges we face and the ways in which we might respond. The worlds we encounter on stage from different times and places can shed light on and help us to understand our contemporary experiences. I've discussed the ways in which, as translators, we work to inhabit the dramatic text and the types of activities that this process involves. I've also proposed how, as we invite audiences to experience the play in translation, they are prompted to reflect on the world that they inhabit and how they inhabit it. So I now want to return to my translation process and my work to inhabit the world of the Anemone and The Boar, and how it's informed my research questions for my Leverhulme research project. I first met Mónica Maffia in 2019 at a festival called Ellas en la del Mira, where she performed her play entitled La Violación de Lucrecia. The festival has been hosted by the Teatro Solís in Montevideo in Uruguay since 2017, and the Solís is one of Uruguay's oldest and most established theatres. Ellas en la del Mira runs throughout the month of March to celebrate the month of women, marked by International Women's Day on the 8th. It presents a series of monologues performed by Latin American women dramatists, and this year it took place online. The name of the festival refers to the space in which the performances take place, the Sala del Mira, This is named after Uruguayan poet Delmira Agostini, who was murdered by her ex-husband in 1914. She's a figure often referred to by today's feminists in Uruguay and beyond as a symbol of the importance of the fight against gender violence. And some of the works from the festival Ellas en la Delmira form part of the corpus for my current research project. When Mónica introduced me to the Anemone and The Boar, her most recent work, in early 2020, it was before I'd started this new research project. My instant reaction was that it captivated my imagination. Mónica's work is always interesting, and she develops very complex characters. We'd also previously collaborated in really fruitful ways when I translated her short play, Complete Sex, in 2019. However, at that stage, I wasn't really sure how this might fit into my research project on Latin American women dramatists as artists, activists, and agents of change. And that's something I've discovered through the process of translating it. So in this final section of my talk, I want to demonstrate how the translation process has inspired and transformed my research questions. I'll provide a bit more of an overview of the play. As I've already stated, it depicts the lives of three women working in a radio station in 1936 in Spain. Two of the characters, Encarnación and Paquita, are radio presenters and are from Spain. The third character is a sound engineer, Carmen, from the River Plate region, so from Uruguay or Argentina. And while supporting the work of the radio program, she also uses some of the equipment to communicate with other activists and organizations to help set up ways for Spanish citizens to go into exile in the River Plate region. She focuses particularly on helping authors, artists, and theatre makers to leave Spain during this period when their lives were at risk as increased violence and threats from right-wing forces were targeted at these groups. This was the experience of many people, not only intellectuals, who went into exile in the build-up to and during the period of the Spanish Civil War. And many did go to the River Plate region, reinforcing a very important connection between that region and Spain, already established through different waves of migration since colonial times throughout the 19th and 20th century, resulting from initiatives to facilitate migration, particularly in the 1800s in Argentina, resulting from political struggles and exile as a result of dictatorships in Uruguay and Argentina and other places in Latin America in the 70s and 80s, and also economic migration. I'm not going to elaborate on that list or go into detail about these different waves of migration, but I just wanted to underline that there's a long history of migration in both directions between Spain and the River Plate region. A really striking example from this period is the Catalan actor and director Margarita Sirkku, who went into exile in Montevideo in Uruguay, where she founded a drama school, the Escuela Multidisciplinaria de Arte Dramático Margarita Sirkku. It still exists today, and she introduced a lot of work from Spain to Montevideo based on her close friendship and working relationship with Lorca. Many contemporary dramatists studied at the EMAD, the school that she founded. That's its abbreviated title with the initials. And so it continues to play an important role in drama training and also in creating opportunities for contemporary dramatists to teach there. As well as translating this play in the early stages of a new research project, there have been a few particularities about translating it at this time and in the ways we're currently working. Last year, the actors were rehearsing on Zoom whilst analysing and reading the text, so I was able to zoom into a rehearsal and hear the text aloud. Secondly, this is a play that has not yet been performed, and I've had the opportunity to have some really interesting discussions with Mónica as we're in dialogue about some of the small changes that she was making to the script during the rehearsal process. We've also discussed some points that I've raised as I've analysed the text for my translation. And so she's decided to clarify or modify some minor things where I've asked questions about how an English-speaking theatre company might approach the text. I know that there will be other translators listening out there who have worked in this kind of situation before, where the original text is still evolving as you are translating. For me, it really reinforced the ways in which translators are close readers, constantly asking questions of the text to reiterate and repeat Pavis again, bombarding it with questions from the target language's point of view. It also reinforced for me the imaginative work that we do as theatre translators in constantly thinking about future performances and seeking to understand the dramatic text, not only as a basis for the spoken lines of a future performance, but also as a basis for other aspects of that performance, scenography, stage directions, nonverbal communication, gesture, and costumes. When I translate the text into English, I want it to become a text with which a theatre company could work and play creatively with based on their own interpretation of the text. A few of my questions to Mónica have been about refining or clarifying a stage direction or an aspect of the relationship between characters, or clarifying what is foregrounded, for example, when a song is played, as is often in the case, because we're dealing with a radio programme in the play. And this enables both the original text and the English translation to be points of departure for theatre companies. The process of translating this play has enabled me to develop research questions about multivocality, how to translate the different voices present in the play and in any one character, as the audience witness the characters both presenting live on air and their off-air interactions with each other. I've created questions about the role that extracts from other works of art and literature play in any given text, and how these other texts affect the translation process. The use of other types of literature within a play can enhance the multivocal quality of texts. It can create connections across cultures and also create links across literary traditions. This process has also enabled me to develop questions about activism and the sites and spaces in which activism takes place and how these are depicted on stage. I've begun to explore how theatre and theatre in translation can be a type of artivism, so activism through art, and how theatre can document and explore instances of activism. So I'll now provide some examples to illustrate this process. One of the really fascinating things about this play is that in many ways it itself centres around a performance, as the play is structured around the 5 episodes of the radio programme Thursdays from the Republic. The programme includes a news item, an anniversary segment, and as well as a radio drama. During the play, we witness the off-air interactions of the characters, which reveal aspects of their private lives, their own reactions to the censorship which affects what they report on and how, and their relationship to each other. So these characters each move between using different kinds of voices as colleagues and friends who are sometimes at odds with one another, to reporters and then to actors as they take on the radio serial. In my work to translate the play, I identified these shifts in the characters' voices, but I was also constantly aware that this was still the same character, that each character is performing multiple roles within the play, but there obviously wasn't a complete disconnect between their different voices, and there were moments when their off-air and on-air personas influence one another. As part of the weekly programme, the 2 presenters perform a serialised radio drama, which is an adaptation of Venus and Adonis by William Shakespeare. Mónica Maffia translated and adapted the Shakespeare text for this play, and this is based on her own extensive experience of translating Shakespeare into Spanish. In this poem, the horns of the boar destroy Adonis, resulting in his death. This is where we get the boar of the title of the play from, and the anemone is the flower which springs forth from the place where Adonis's blood was shed. Another text which is incorporated into the play is Federico Garcia Lorca's poem, Llanto por la muerte de Ignacio Sánchez Mejías, Lament for the death of Sánchez Mejías, which mourns the death of the bullfighter gored to death by a bull. So there are links between these 2 texts. In this case, and in the case of the Lorca poem, the original is in Spanish and extracts are included throughout the play. Both of these are performed at different parts by the 2 presenters, Encarnación and Paquita. In the original Spanish text, what we encounter is a new translation and adaptation of the Shakespeare text. And although Shakespeare is an internationally recognised author, the radio adaptation means that it would be less familiar to the audience of the play. However, I expect that the Lorca poem would be more familiar to the audience of the original. It was also originally written in Spanish and appears in Spanish in the play, so it isn't transformed in the same way. So one of the considerations at the beginning of my translation process, which we did resolve very quickly, was would I translate Mónica's adaptation of the Shakespeare text back into English? The answer is no. In analysing the text and discussing this with the playwright, I identified that there's perhaps a kind of inversion that occurs through the process of translating the play into English and in terms of the audience's experience of the play. The inversion that I'm referring to is that for an English-speaking audience and a London-based audience, which is what I was particularly imagining, I expect that they would be much more familiar with the Shakespeare than the Lorca, so it is Venus and Adonis that becomes the more recognisable text rather than the Lorca poem. So what I decided to do is that it would be the Shakespeare poem that undergoes less of a transformation. And to achieve that, with Monica's really careful help, I referred back to the Shakespeare poem to select parts of the text that she had used as a basis for her version of the radio play. And so the majority of the extracts used in my English version of the play are taken directly from Shakespeare. However, when it came to Lorca, I created my own new translation of the poem for the play. So in my translation, Lorca became transformed for a British audience through a translation that I did specifically for this play, in a similar way in which Monica had translated Shakespeare into Spanish specifically for the play. In creating a new translation of the Lorca poem, I was able to emphasize some of the links to Shakespeare in my choice of vocabulary, for example, through references to violence, the colour red and its political associations, and the imagery associated with loss and acts of mourning. These are all recurring tropes throughout the play, which intersect with the off-air experiences of the presenters and the context of Spain at the time. Furthermore, for the radio presenters, the act of embodying the characters in the radio serial serves as a device to explore other aspects of their lives at the time. One of the presenters, Paquita, is a frustrated actress who was forced to give up acting when she got married, and we learn that her husband is violent towards her, causing her to arrive at work with a bruised face for one of the programs. Encarnacion tries to support her friend and co-worker not only by underlining the significant advances in women's rights that were achieved during that time, which would enable Paquita to instigate divorce proceedings, but also by offering her the opportunity to participate in initiatives to take theatre and creative activities to children living in small towns where they don't have the same access to cultural activities as in the city of Madrid. This is a project which Encarnacion feels passionately about, and she also eventually becomes involved with initiatives to help and support refugee children. The other character, Carmen, who is the sound engineer from the River Plate, accompanies them in their performances in the radio serial with music, jingles, and sound effects. But perhaps most significantly for the development of the play and for the representation of activism in the play, she worked secretively outside of the regular hours of the radio programme, using some of the radio equipment, most importantly the station's antenna, as well as some of her own improvised tools to communicate to help set up emergency evacuations. She actually communicates using cue codes, which remain the same in both the Spanish and English versions of the text, but which initially took me down some quite interesting routes in the early stages of my research. Carmen uses the technology available to her and her skills and initiative to set up this communication with other groups. As I started my research into the ways in which communities of activists and practitioners are formed in Latin America, I've been struck by the ways in which digital technology plays a role not only in how artists and activists work together, but also in how they share and disseminate their work using digital platforms, including social media. And I've begun to explore this by drawing on the work of Marcela A. Fuentes in her recent book, Performance Constellations, Networks of Protest and Activism in Latin America. Performance constellations is a term that she uses to describe the interconnectedness of off and on air or often online activist interventions. I've also been in constant dialogue with my colleague Renata Brandal, who I was working with in the Language Acts and World Making project. She always reminds me that, and this is a short quote from a forthcoming publication that I have permission to share, she always tells me, digital technology is simply the latest technological tool. That's the end of the quote. But she always goes on to explain that technology is able to advance communication, exchange ideas, and create activism. Carmen's use of the radio equipment is a wonderful illustration of the ways in which technology facilitates the creation of communities of activists and has done so throughout history. The work which she does in secret and in the space of the radio station, but between programmes, caused me to reflect on the sites in which activism takes place. It is a space where she subverts the intended use, she disrupts the power of the authorities, and she uses her position and her knowledge of how to use the equipment to support the movement into exile of vulnerable individuals. In researching and developing this translation, I've been very aware of the ways in which Mónica Maffia has created the language for her characters, a language which draws on and interpolates the literary works of Lorca and Shakespeare to tell both personal and national stories. One through which we feel the pressure of the authorities, but then maybe see a flip side and a release of that pressure during off-air exchanges between the characters. And also we see the manipulation of language as a sign through the codes used by Carmen, accompanied by her use of technology. These considerations of the language, the sites, and the technology of activism are significant for my research project. This is because one of the starting points for my research into Latin American women dramatists as artists, activists, and agents of change were a series of street performances directed by Uruguayan activist, artist, and scholar Ekaterina Delgado. These performances, called La Caída de las Campanas, the falling of the bells, took place in the streets of Montevideo in Uruguay over a 2-year period from 2015 to 2017. And her work has continued to develop in lots of different ways. The performance, which involved a group of people who identify as women, occupying the public space and disrupting the soundscape of the city through ringing bells, took place every time a woman was killed as a result of gender-based violence or feminicide. Here I choose to use the term feminicide, which is a translation of the Spanish feminicidio, a term which was introduced into the academic world in 1987 by Mexican feminist, scholar, activist, and politician Marcela Lagarde y de los Rios, and I'll return to this term in a moment. The act of repetition was central to La Caída de las Campanas, as the ringing of the bells was created through the repeated actions of the performers falling to the ground and then rising again. The repetition was also a significant formal aspect of the piece, as it was enacted after each feminicide as a public act of mourning, but also as a way to challenge state institutions and their complicity in this violence, because the chosen site for performance was one that was symbolically linked to Uruguay as a democracy. Many of the performances were recorded and subsequently shared online via social media. The performance itself is not text-based, and this has raised questions for me of researching, translating, and writing about performance methodologies, which is something that I've begun to do. A performance which shares some of these features, which may be more recognisable, it shares some of the features, particularly in the way that the sites for performance question and attack the role of official institutions in perpetuating violence against women, but which emerged very forcefully from the Chilean context, was the 2019 intervention Un violador en tu camino, a rapist in your path, by Chilean feminist collective Las Tesis. It was first performed in front of a police building in Valparaiso, Chile, and then in Santiago on the 25th of November 2019, the International Day for the Elimination of Violence Against Women. Afterwards, it was recorded and disseminated by social media and used as the basis for a series of follow-on performances throughout the world. This performance did include spoken text by the performers, incorporating text by Latin American feminist scholars, most notably Rita Segato, and Las Tesis seek to transform the ways in which we understand feminist scholarship through performance. This was then translated into other languages and used as a basis for the series of follow-on performances by women throughout Latin America and Europe. Scholars such as Deborah Martin and Deborah Shaw have begun to explore how this text has travelled and how it's been transformed as it is adapted to speak about the specific concerns in the new context and the new site of performance. Nuala Finnegan spoke in her recent keynote at the Association of Hispanists of Great Britain and Ireland conference about translating and performing A Rapist in Your Path in the context of a university, the University College Cork, where she works. She discussed some of the complexities and challenges of translating the word feminicidio, which is used in the song, into English. Feminicidio is used to refer to the killing of women, both because they are women and because of the structures and inequalities within society that enable violence against women to exist. So it seeks to always and necessarily refer to systemic violence. In this way, I see that it actively expands the scope of the term femicide, which is used in English to refer to the murder of women. Feminicidio, to refer to the work of scholars Rosalinda Fregoso and Cynthia Bejarano, bridges the public and private by always referring to the societal structures which make violence permissible. In her lecture, Finnegan raised the question, what is the work that extra syllable does when we use it in English? So what happens when we speak of feminicide rather than femicide? I was struck by the ways in which she ascribed a possible performative function to it, which feels relevant and important when working to research, translate, and engage with theatre and performance dealing with these issues. The performative functions that she suggested are, it marks an excess of violence, it creates an extra space which inverts the power balance and recognises women's voices by pushing back against silencing, or perhaps it creates an afterlife for those women who have died as a result of violence, forcing us to recognise an absence. In raising these questions, Finnegan poses an important challenge for us as translators and researchers. How do we engage with these terms and these theories which emerge from a specific context, and then use them to understand not only the specificities of violence against women in that context, but also beyond it? Through translation, as we explore how those terms can function in a new place. This forms part of my process of articulating ideas in order to experiment with the key terms for my research project. As I define and shape my research, I want to actively work to include terms which emerge from the theatre and performance of Latin American women dramatists, as well as scholars, researchers, and activists working in those contexts. So to conclude, I want to return to The Anemone and The Boar and to articulate some of the research questions that have emerged from the process of translation and which interact with some of the issues at the heart of the performances that I've just discussed. These questions have become central to my research project as I examine and explore the links between the legacies of activism through the art and through the creative work of Latin American women dramatists. These questions are: how can we create translations which play creatively with the ways in which the original text is in dialogue with other literary or critical texts? How might these help to create connections between source and target context in productive ways, as, for example, an English-speaking audience witnessed Shakespeare as part of a narrative about the experience of women in the Second Spanish Republic? How can the connections created through the intertextuality with these literary texts create a way for translators and researchers to historicize and contextualize acts of activism through theatre and performance? And how can we achieve that through our translation process? For me, that is to say through the translations, but also through our writing, scholarship, and presentation around our work. In reflecting on Carmen's actions in the play, I made a connection to broader questions I want to explore as to where activism takes place. What are the sites for activism and artivism, and how might theatre and theatre in translation be both a site for activism, but also one where stories and narratives about activism are told? What are the terms that I want to use to describe this space and to articulate it and to express the actions that she and other activists undertake? I promised that this talk would pose lots of questions. I sought to show how these research questions have emerged forcefully from the work to translate The Anemone and The Boar, whilst engaged in a process of reflecting critically on other texts, performances, and questions that make up my research project. I started by discussing how translation can shape and transform our thinking, and I've demonstrated how this can happen within a research project. I've also shown how, through a process of inhabiting the text, I've been able to articulate these questions for my project. I now invite your questions and your comments, and I'd really love to hear from many of you. Thank you so much for your time and for listening.
Thank you, Sophie. That was fabulous. There was plenty of questions at the end, but plenty of really interesting thoughts all the way through, which had me taking lots of notes here, and I'm sure our audience has been doing the same. So can I invite our audience to put questions in the Q&A, and then we'll put those to Sophie. We've got 40 minutes or so in principle for our Q&A session. So do please let us have your questions. In the meantime, I wanted Sophie to ask about, I think there's some really interesting concepts that you're working with in your talk, and you began, and the notion of inhabiting and physicality is an important one that runs through your talk. And I was just wondering whether you could point to specific impact on your translation practice that thinking about translation in this way has. If you're thinking about translation as, I really like that idea of the translator as a tenant as well. I'm thinking about kind of the physicality of drama being carried over into the translation process itself. I was wondering how that might have affected your own practice as a translator, because you referred at one point to the way in which you decided to change the emphasis with the intertext, with the Shakespeare and the Lorca. And I think it's always fascinating to hear about the kind of the specifics of the translation process, particularly in the context of some very interesting concepts like this. So, inhabiting the translator as tenant, are there particular features of your own translation approach which have been affected by that?
I think that's actually quite a lot of questions. You've done exactly what I did, Duncan. You've asked lots of questions, but I really welcome them, and I will try not to speak for too long on this so that we can bring other people into the dialogue. I think for me, writing about that idea of inhabiting the text was also just to kind of give a sort of broader sense of my work and my practice. I've done a lot of work on our and writing about the work of the theatre translator and imagination, and that's really important part of my process, and in some ways quite easy to articulate aspects of it, the idea of kind of playing the play in your head, but it's also kind of this idea of thinking about future possible performances. And so I spent a lot of time thinking about our imaginative work, but for me there really is another part of this work where you're occupying this world of the text, and you're required, as I described, all those kind of small acts of movement, to go and do research, to explore different spaces and explore different types of articulation. And I think for me, this idea of moving into the text is incredibly powerful, because that's also what I really envisage other theatre creatives doing as they at a later stage. And so for me, I think it's really important as a theatre translator to also imagine myself doing that. What does that mean for me in practice kind of every day? It means things like actually the text kind of always being there and always being in dialogue with the other types of research that I'm doing. It will at later stages involve me reading aloud with other colleagues, with other actors, so bringing people into that process. But I think for me, thinking about inhabiting is really useful in placing the emphasis on me and the work that I do, because when we talk about translation, we often talk about the text moving across and the text traveling, and for me that's inevitable, and that is part of what we're doing in translation. So for me to think about what I'm physically doing, I'm moving in, I'm occupying that space, I'm occupying that imaginative world, but I'm also doing all these other small acts of movement that make the theatre translation robust and make it playable. And I think when I started to develop some of these ideas on inhabiting, I was particularly looking at a theatre text which already had this idea of retelling as part of the narrative. It was based on a legend, and it starts off with the idea that the story would be told, had been told before and would be retold and passed on again. And I thought and it was in reflecting on that and reflecting on Aaltonen's work that I thought, actually, if I can see myself as part of this retelling, as inhabiting the text, as someone else who then tells you to go and retell it, then that's a really creative way of me becoming part of that text and part of that literary tradition, rather than just focusing on how the text is moving. So for me, it's all this type of research, it's all these small movements that we make, but it's also about recognizing my role in the creative team of bringing this text to life.
Thank you, Sophie.
Thank
and
you.
The remarks and questions have started coming in on the Q&A. Top of the list at the moment is our colleague Ceci Rossi saying thank you for such a wonderful talk. Another colleague, Steve Waters, brilliant talk, Sophie. Inhabiting the play is a terrific idea and could have an analogue in the role of the director and actor too, and corresponds to my own writing process. I don't know if you would like to come in on that comment. Inhabiting the play is a terrific idea and could have an analogue in the role of the director and actor too.
Yeah, I mean, I think that relates. Maybe Steve was typing as I was talking, because I think that relates to what I said about kind of whole creative teams moving in and thinking of the translator as part of that creative team. But I think as well, if I can just, maybe I'll just go back to the quotation that I shared from Aaltonen, because what's useful for me in that is that she does bring in, she does refer to the other creatives who will then move in. Let me just see if I can locate it, because maybe this is just useful for us to go back to. So translators and through their entire theatrical systems or subsystems move into texts which have been found suitable for a particular purpose. And then she goes on to talk about the idea of tenants and new tenants. So for me, I think she's talking about the translator, but she's talking about wider teams as well. So it would be great to have more of a dialogue with Steve about that. That's really wonderful to hear.
Matt Mackay saying great seminar with lots of food for thought. Valentina Rapetti, thank you, Dr. Stevens, a truly inspiring and thoughtful talk. Thank you for sharing details on your translation and research process. Valentina has a question following on from that. How does working with English-speaking actors on translated plays enrich your translation and research process?
Brilliant question, and thanks for those lovely comments as well, because one is always quite nervous when sharing their process in case people go, really? But it seems to be doing lots of productive work so far. So thank you for those lovely comments. The question about working with actors absolutely really informs my process and enhances it tremendously. So I'm fortunate to be part of the Out of the Wings collective, where we work with many actors to read through translations, but also the Out of the Wings collective is made up of a really diverse group of creatives, translators, directors and actors. So we also do table reads, and that has been a place and space for me to share my work as well. Hearing the text, this is a very simple thing, but hearing the text in someone else's voice and someone else's intonation will always change how you think about it. And that actually happens in the original and in the translation. So I just wanted to mention the original there, because like I said, I zoomed into a rehearsal, and hearing the text in the voice of those actors already transformed my thinking on it. When it comes to the translation, it's often after I've produced several drafts, that I will take a text to work with actors, and the questions that they ask, this idea of the dialogue with the text, many of the questions that I now ask when I am translating a dramatic text, when I'm at that stage when I'm on my own doing the translation work, are questions that have been informed by the questions that actors ask. And so that's where I think for me this idea of the sort of dramaturgical sensibility comes through. Those questions are always so helpful and so enlightening. There are also questions that might be posed where I realise that actually it's perhaps not my job to answer them. There might be questions that actually it's up to a director or an actor themselves to resolve about a character or about a situation. So it's also thinking about what the text is doing and what the information there in the text is doing for the actor, and how they work with that, and how their work kind of informs what you're doing as a translator. But then it's the basis for a lot of creative work for them as they develop the characters. So if you are translating theatre, I would always encourage you to find those opportunities where you can hear the text aloud, because and have that dialogue around it, because it really transforms it. And then there's maybe a later stage if you are preparing a reading or actually a performance where you might be in the rehearsal room working with actors, then obviously with a very specific goal, and that kind of changes the focus of it. But again, those questions are still so important. So it's always a joy to work with actors and to hear those words in a voice that isn't my own, and is often, even if I know the actor, an unexpected interpretation and intonation. It's really, really wonderful and enriching.
Thanks, Sophie. Plenty of questions coming in. Can I invite you also to upvote questions that you like? So that involves simply, I think it's just clicking on the thumbs up, and that will move a question up the list, and that will help me, help us to see which ones you're particularly interested in having answered. Flor says, thanks so much, love it. We have a response from Mónica Maffia. What an inspiring paper and remarkable insight into the bodily aspects of translation, the sheer physicality of it. Great idea. I'm so moved and grateful for your vision of my play and your extraordinary translation of The Anemone and The Boar. I'd like to ask Sophie, what makes her choose a play to dedicate so much time and effort to have it translated?
Oh, wow, this is what a question, Mónica. Thank you so much for being here. Well, obviously, the opportunity to work with wonderful playwrights is one of the reasons I choose plays. No, that is actually true. But working with Mónica has been a wonderfully rich and enjoyable process, and I've learned so much from working with her. I mean, there are so many different things that might lead me to translate a play, and I won't go into kind of all the material things. I'm going to think about this specifically in the context of my project. And I think even before developing the current research project, I had a real interest in plays which portrayed in some way that maybe surprised me or intrigued me, or connected with something that I saw around me, that portrayed the experience of women in a really in those intriguing and diverse ways. And so that was what instantly attracted me to this play, and also the kind of network of women, these three women with their contradictions and complexities. So I think that was a criteria that I'd been working with for translating plays for a while. But I mean, actually, to go back to some things I've already said, I think there is, it has to captivate my imagination, and I think I'm often if it's a play that I'm encountering through reading it, I'm often already kind of thinking about how I'm playing it in my mind. And that process of playing it in my mind is often also imagining it and projecting it into the target context where I'm working now. So I guess it has to be, often a play that really intrigues me is a play that I could really see speaking into our current context and being performed and worked with actors and all of those things. And so in that sense, actually, and this, I referred to Nuala Finnegan's work in my talk, and she, although she didn't specifically use this Inhabiting, she talks about kind of living with the words of a text, and for me that is inhabiting. And so I guess it's also got to be a text that I want to move into, that I want to spend some time with, and that I think can be really creative to work with. And I suppose in that idea of creativity, I'm not just thinking about me as translating it, but as we've all seen, my translation is always feeding into my research. So is it also one where I might find those terms, those expressions for my research, where I might find broader ideas and concepts that I think could also further my research project. So within the context, I think, without talking about kind of lots of other contexts where you might be commissioned and things like that, which are quite different, I think those are the sort of parameters that I've set and that have been have enabled me to work with some really, really interesting dramatists.
Thanks, Sophie. Our colleague Tom Bowles, thanks for a fascinating talk, Sophie. Comment from Kate Eaton. Great talk, Sophie. I too love the idea of the translator as tenant, shared occupation with the playwright, temporarily inhabiting the world of the text, passing it on to the actors and director to set up camp, then to accommodate the audience, then giving tenancy up to other occupants who come later. So Kate's really running with the
Perfect. Thank you, Kate. Yeah, I think that's great. I think that, yeah, and that recognition that you're also not, it's a shared tenancy. So you're not the only one. I think yeah, that's really helpful and really eloquent. Thank you, Kate.
Marta Fernandez says, fascinante, such interesting research, Sophie. Gracias for your talk today. Can you talk a little more about how your work of close collaboration with authors like Mónica informs your own translation process? I'm wondering about the ways in which that knowledge of the author's own process and relationship to their text may inform your translation of that text and that process of inhabiting the play.
That is a really fantastic question. Thank you so much, Marta, for being here and for asking that question. I can actually get it up in front of me, so I'm reading at the same time, but I'm going to stop doing that. I have always found dialogues with playwrights to be really, really fruitful. I've said this before, but I think it's worth reiterating that I've never had a dialogue except where I've really said, what does this word, if I've really said, what does this word mean? I cannot find it in any dictionary, and they give me the answer. Then I have gone and changed my translation. But I've rarely had a conversation where I've thought, right, I must go and radically rework this. What the conversations with playwrights have always done for me is just given me kind of more insight into their process, and also maybe more insight into the context, the surrounding the play, but also some of the issues that they wanted to explore. And that's always given me lots to think about that has fed into my process. I think these moments, like with the kind of Lodka and Shakespeare, where we're thinking about what is the effects on the audience, that was a really interesting dialogue with Mónica, and realizing that there could maybe be this flip of what is more familiar and where might the transformation take place. And for me, I think those, knowing how Mónica had worked through creating an adaptation for this play, so an adaptation to create the radio serial within the play, really inspired me. So I think those processes can be really inspiring and can help me to think about what I would like to do. So again, they don't, this, in that instance, it really did kind of give me the confidence. I'd been researching existing Lodka translations and seeking advice on those from colleagues. And that conversation, including a conversation with Catherine Boyle as well, actually, about this, really gave me the confidence to say, I'm going to have a go at translating this Lorca and going through that and enabling that to be the part that's transformed. That came from that conversation with Mónica and a little bit more of a conversation with Catherine, who was guiding me on some Lorca translations. So I think that they can be really creative insights which can inspire my own process. And I suppose the main point with that is that I see myself as creating a new dramatic text when I'm translating. So learning about those processes that playwrights have undertaken to create the dramatic text can also feed into my process. and yield really interesting results.
Thanks, Sophie. You've made it very straightforward for me to choose the next question by mentioning Catherine, and Catherine's question is at the top of the list anyway. Hello, Catherine. Catherine asks, I would love to hear Sophie say more about how her being a translator researcher has had an impact on how she works across translation, the digital work, and artivism.
I think, thank you, Catherine. It's great that you're here, and thanks for that question. I think one of the concepts when I've been thinking about these kind of the digital networking and how that affects the ways in which works are circulated and disseminated, is I've been thinking of a concept that we used in language arts and world making, which is the contact zones. But the reason this concept is so useful both for kind of thinking about digital engagement and digital circulation is thinking about the kind of contact zones offered through digital platforms. But obviously contact zones is something I'm constantly thinking about in translation. And so where there might be contact with another culture which transforms the way a text is produced in the original, but also where there's contact, where I see these moments of contact, and sort of this idea of points of contact is one I've written about before, between two cultures. So this idea of a point of contact in the experience of women that I see depicted in this play being a way that does enable that that movement across of the text, and also enables an audience to engage with the text when it's translated. So for me, actually, the questions that I've been asking in translation, they're not all of the questions, but actually these concepts have helped me to shape questions I want to ask about digital activism, about artivism, and about these types of transformation. I think a big question that I'm thinking about now as I'm translating is how my own work is part of that. And I was kind of aware of this when I was shaping the Leverhulme research project, but I think I've become more aware of it surprisingly in doing it, given that that's what kind of the point of my talk was, that in doing the translating we get to understand new things. And so I'm constantly thinking about how my translation work is not only asking the questions, but is also producing the translation that contributes to this circulation of texts, possibly in digital formats, and as a type of art and activism connection. And I think that's where, just to pick up on one thing I said in the talk about kind of thinking also about translating performance methodologies, about historicizing these types of activism and sort of contemporary digital activism that we see, historicizing that how I see my role in that as a translator researcher is really important, and I believe that I have some of the skills and the questions to ask that can help us to do that, which I think is really, really important.
Thank you, Sophie. A question from Claudia Cruz. First of all, thank you for that brilliant talk. I, like you, translate and do research on theatre translation, and I strongly believe in bringing the translator into the staging process. What do you think about that, and what are the differences between translating a theatre text in close contact with the author or not? Okay, that's another big question at the end. Bringing the translator into the staging process.
Yeah, well, I think an earlier question made me reflect on kind of how working with the actors transforms my process. I think it's a dialogue, and I think it works the other way. I absolutely advocate for the translator in the rehearsal room. I think that really enhances the work that is produced, the way that the actors are able to work with the text, and the insights that they're able to get precisely from the research that you've done, but also if they do have queries or questions about it. So yeah, I absolutely see that as a dialogue and a really important part of the process, and the times when I've been in the rehearsal room have been really fruitful. And there are other people writing about this and sort of talking about this in the Translators Association, in other theatre collectives and theatre translation collectives, about the importance of the translator having a space in the rehearsal room and being acknowledged and credited for that work. And I think it's really, really important.
Dominika Mariankowska has a short question. Would you say that literary translation is solitary work, while translating plays requires a group collaboration?
That's such an interesting question, isn't it? Gosh, there's lots of ways I could go with that as well, because one of the things I've been reflecting on during this, just to sort of bring it back maybe to this strange pandemic time, is how often to get out that first draft, what I have said is, I just need a bit of space on my own, and then I'll get it down and that first draft will be out. And I suppose one could argue I've had quite a lot of that during this time, but actually I felt an immense need to be connected, and so it's been really, really interesting trying to do those types of work where I've always before said, well, what I need is a bit of time on my own. But my point with that is, I think there are stages to it, and I think, you know, there's a stage where you will be on your own writing and creating the draft, but I think that in the fullness of the process, it becomes very collaborative. But, you know, the things that I was talking about, I see lots of synergies with literary translation, and the things that I'm talking about with the discussions with the author, with the playwright Mónica and other playwrights, you know, I know that goes on in literary translation as well. So I think there are lots of similarities in the process. I also know lots of literary translators who really value the opportunity to work, to have their work read aloud. So I think there are lots of crossovers and really interesting links. And I think for me, I suppose but what I'm always envisaging is something that is very collaborative, because that is what the process of staging a play is, and that feeds constantly into my process. And so if it goes through to its fullness, to a reading or performance, it will necessarily be collaborative. But there are moments, I think, when it's more of that individual and imaginative work, which is also really important. So I think there are great crossovers there, and more discussions that we can have, but it's a really interesting point to raise. Thank you.
Ihab Al-Nuzaili says, amazing talk. And Ray Ndebi from Yaoundé, Cameroon, just brilliant. I'm learning so much on the attitude of a translator towards a specific culture. It's so wonderful that through being online, our research seminars are able to open up to an audience which is far wider than we would ever be able to have if we were in person in Norwich. Ray asks, is inhabiting a play a simple task? Is it different regarding the play, or have you drawn a method you apply to all contexts? So yes, is inhabiting a play a simple task? Is it different regarding the play, or have you drawn a method you can apply to all contexts?
I suppose that's a really brilliant question. I suppose that a very simple answer is that I always view my translation process also as a process of research, and so I suppose as a starting point, those two things together will always be going on, whatever the text is. But depending on what the text is, those types of research and the kind of different worlds I might inhabit as I'm getting to grips with the text, and the different other texts I might be forced to inhabit, or obliged to inhabit, forced to inhabit, choose to inhabit, you know, like with getting back into Shakespeare and things like that for this one, and that will very much depend on the text. So I think as a starting point, it's always I'm always asking those questions about the translation, but also about the research around it, and then that starts the process of what I need to do, and what are the different physical space I might inhabit, like a library or whatever, or the other texts that I might inhabit as well, and how I might work with them depends on how they appear in the text and the work I see them doing in that text. So so I think it really does change. But also, I suppose, maybe just to reiterate something I said in the talk, or maybe tried to say, was it will always require this kind of this actual movement. I'm always required to go somewhere. I can't do the whole thing, even in these times. I cannot do the whole thing where I am right now, and I think that's important. And even if it's just the case that I have to go outside to look at some flowers to try to remember what an anemone looks like, you know, even if it's just something as simple as that, actually that movement, that reminder that it's always taking me outside of my actual current surroundings and current ways of thinking, and being open to that is incredibly important as a basis for the translation process and for my work.
Thanks, Sophie. Mónica has come back with a follow-up thought, and she says, interesting how this inhabiting the play gives new resonances to the word reflection on translation, not just as meditation, as an intellectual process, but also as a body, as a muscle reaction to embrace the other.
Yeah, that's fantastic. Thank you, Mónica. That's and I think, yeah, those ideas about kind of the physicality and using that as a way to think about our relationship to something that may initially seem very distant or different, I think are really useful for me in the process, and thinking of that, you know, to go back to this idea of the body, you know, thinking of that in the body of actors in the original and in the body of those actors who will perform it in the English translation. And so I think I think it's really great that you picked up on that. And for me, the physicality of it is really, really important, and it is about that relationship.
Sophie, there's a question here about one aspect of the talk we haven't really gone into so far in the questions, and that's the activism. Pelin Korkmaz says, thank you for this amazing talk. Can translating theatre for the deaf or hard of hearing be studied within the context of activism?
Wow, what a fantastic question. That's a brilliant question, and it's certainly not within kind of the remits of my project, so I don't want to I probably can't say that much about it, except that I think there definitely would be creative ways of thinking of it in that way, and also thinking about the sort of particular questions you might ask in that translation process, how those interact with questions about activism and about and maybe about rights for the community that you're translating for, and the groups that you're translating for. So I think, you know, in this kind of process that I've tried to speak about, where actually for me kind of the theory and the research is actually generated in that process of doing the translation, so the questions but also some of the key terms that I want to use, I think if I can see that happening in other processes, and so that would that might generate really interesting questions relating to translating for deaf audiences. So I can see kind of connections there, but I think it would, you know, it would be about that particular undertaking that particular process.
A question from Elton Uliana. I would love to hear more about how Sophie translates dialogue. What are the initial steps? When does she take the text to be read by actors, if that is the case? Are there similarities between her method and the authors that she is aware of? Amazing work, Sophie, said Elton to conclude. Dialogue, translating dialogue.
Thanks, Elton. That's brilliant that you're here and that you've asked that question. I think this talk may not show that, but I listen a lot. And I do, I think that I've heard other translators say this. I think a great way to translate dialogue is to listen a lot. But I also listen to the radio, I listen to podcasts. And I think that really informs how I translate dialogue and is a really, really useful tool. Also, I think in the very early stages, there can sometimes be a temptation to kind of, particularly if I'm, if it's something I'm really into, or if I've seen the text already performed in the original, I might be kind of jumping ahead with how I think the dialogue works. And so there's always that initial stage where I almost have to take myself back and make sure that actually I'm really understanding and working with the complexities of the text before worrying about it sounding like dialogue. So that initial stage is really making sure that everything is there and that I really understand the text, I understand what it's doing, and then it's developing it as dialogue. And I talked a little bit about kind of hearing that in table reads and with other colleagues, and that's always a really, really useful process. And so I think in terms of kind of relating it to the playwright's process, I suppose one of the things that I found, if I'm able to access a performance of the play in the original, is that the rhythm often really, that's where the rhythm really comes through, and then I'm able to think about that quite a lot when I'm translating. And it might not be not in I don't want, not in the sense of kind of necessarily saying this must have exactly the same rhythm, but I guess what it makes me aware of is what role is rhythm and pace, and the pace at which this dialogue is possibly able to be performed. How important is that, and how might I create that in English to give some of those options to a theatre company here? So I think, yeah, I hope that's given kind of some insights, but I think listening, I think working with actors, I think thinking about pace and rhythm from the original, and I think making, before you worry about it being dialogue, worry about it, about having everything that is in that text.
That's great advice, Sophie. You've been so generous with your responses to questions. We're coming to towards the end of our time, but perhaps to conclude, I could put you one question which actually came first of all, and I've been holding it back because it is quite a general question, and I think it would be appropriate to finish with this. It's from an anonymous attendee who says, hello and thank you. My MA thesis focused on a translation of some of the non-theatre writings of a 17th century Chinese playwright.
Oh, wow.
They were not plays, but it was important to recognize how the writer's theatrical background informed his prose writing. When rendering such historical literary texts or plays into English, should the translator's goal be faithfulness to the response the playwright wanted to elicit in his or her day? Or should the translator focus on eliciting an analogous response for a contemporary audience or readership? If the latter, does this not cross from translation over to adaptation?
So the big question for last, what an exciting project. Thanks for sharing some information on that. That sounds so fantastic. And I find it very difficult to talk about and specify kind of this idea, even when I'm in dialogue with playwrights, this idea of kind of the intention of the author. For me, that has to come more from the text and kind of the intention of the text and the way the text is working, rather than this idea of authorial intent. If you're able to do research and kind of understand how some of the impacts that a text had in society or on audiences, then I think it can be really interesting and creative to think about how you might create that a similar type of effect or impact through your translation. And obviously that's where all your research and also thinking about some of the strategies we've discussed today, but many more, come into it. But I think I think dealing with a historical text can be quite different as well, because there's often this tendency to update, and that may make it feel more like an adaptation. And I think it really depends on, depends on the text, depends on the context, very refrains of translators. But I think obviously it depends on the original project. But I do think I would argue, though, that there is a way to think about the intention of the text, to think about and research some of the impact that it had on the audience, to think about those questions as you're translating, and for it to be a translation which does play creatively with all those ideas, which brings in that research, but that doesn't necessarily have to be an adaptation. I think it can, that there are ways of working informed by your research and informed by thinking of how the text works and then how it might work in the target language, that can be really productive, really creative, and really exciting for audiences as well as for the translator.
Okay, we've had 20 questions altogether. You've dealt with them all, Sophie. Before we need to wrap up, but before we do so, let me just mention that although this is the last in our research seminar series, we do, BCLT, have 2 major events still to come before the end of our academic year here in the UK. And they are our annual Zeebaut lecture, which is being given on the 2nd of June this year, hosted online by the British Library, and our speaker is Jhumpa Lahiri. And before that, on the 14th, 15th of May, we're hosting a conference, Eco-Translation, responding to the work of Michael Cronin. Full details and booking links for those events are available on our webpage, the BCLT events page, bclt.org.uk/events. So there are some exciting things to come, but we've just had a very exciting session. And thank you so much to everybody for your questions. And above all, thank you, Sophie, for a fabulous presentation and for giving such generous responses to the questions as well. Thank you, everybody, and hope to see you next time.
Thank you very much, Duncan. Thank you, everyone, for your questions.